Yes, the next one. Antonio, the first one. I mean, yes. 10 years ago, I made quantification of general quantification of fine pottery finds from all excavated areas in Pompeiopolis, and as you see, there was almost 30,000 fragments. And in Pompeiopolis, we have three chronological components of fine pottery. Of course, Luisa will criticize me, but for the Black Sea, we use the term early Roman pottery for the first centuries AD. I mean, first, second, third century. So we have, from that time, we have terra sigillata, which was the main fineware throughout the empire at that time. And you can see it's quite a lot, 50% of the material, but it's due to the extremely high fragmentation of the finds. And the second component is late antiquity, so-called red slipwares or late Roman terra sigillata. And then the latest main component, it's early Byzantine from the 6th, 7th century, which is locally made, because before, in early Roman times and late antiquity, almost all finewares were imported. And the main change happened between end of the 5th and early 6th century, when the import stopped and fine pottery began to be produced here. The next slide. So from the beginning, when we look at the topography of the distribution of production centers of early Roman terra sigillata, we see then in the east we have in many centers in Italy. The first one in North Africa. In the east we have in the Eastern Mediterranean we have a series of so-called Eastern terra sigillata, Eastern sigillata A, B, C, D. From North Syria, from Pisidia, in the Meander Valley and around Pergamon, and also in the first century AD, production of sigillata began in the Black Sea, around the Black Sea region, and the main production center was so-called Pontic sigillata. So it is a general term because this pottery is present along the coast of the whole Black Sea, also in the north, despite the local production in the Bosporan region in the Hellenistic time, actually, and late Hellenistic time, and in Chersonesos in the early Roman times, and also in Maesia and Dacia, especially in the second century. But Pontic sigillata is present in many contexts of the first century AD until the second half of the third century. And it's a hypothesis because we didn't find workshops. My hypothesis is that the workshops were located in the western part of the province of Pontus. But actually the term was introduced in the 70s, describing imports of this pottery in the Mediterranean and used especially by John Hayes. And at that time it meant Pontic as Pontus Euxinus as the Black Sea material. So, but in this case, I think it's quite, let's say, convenient that this name could also match the actual production region. The next slide, please. So we have the typology. There is actually no good classification of this pottery, unfortunately, in the Black Sea. Nobody did it, and the most useful, let's say, is the basic typology from the 1985 by John Hayes. He based on the imports of the Black Sea of this pottery in the Mediterranean. We can see that this, especially plates, were imitated Italian originals, and also some of the bowls. But then, especially in the second century, when production of terra sigillata in Italy declined, let's say, in the Black Sea, in Pontus, it continued, and they developed other vessels, like, for example, like bigger bowls, like skiphoi, like this oval, or a big, let's say, dishes with relief handles. Next slide. Yes. So, and the big difference between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea region is that we have in here a lot of jacks in, let's say, Interior Sigillata. In the Mediterranean, the presence of jacks were extremely limited, and here also in Pompeiopolis we have a lot of jacks. Next slide. But the problem in Pompeiopolis, the material is extremely fragmented. We find Pontic sigillata in almost every context, from the real early Roman context until the early Byzantine context, as residual materials, and so many of them are just body fragments, mostly fragments of jacks. And of course, I count them, but it's difficult to let's say, to identify real forms. So that's why the finds of early Roman fine pottery is not the priority at the moment, because we don't excavate real, the objects from that time. Of course, we have theater, which was built in the early Roman times, but then at that time it was used, so we don't find corresponding materials, and what we found in the theater are the accumulations of rubbish from the late antiquity. Next slide. So, but I can show you just some examples of Pontic sigillata from Crimea, from excavations made in Ukraine. So, just to have idea how the complete vessels looked like. The next slide. Yeah, so plates, bowls, typically it's already, let's say, the late phase of production in the early 1st century. And so the quality is not so good. And then talking about imports, when we assume that the production of Pontic sigillata took place here in Western Pontus, Amasya and Caesarea, in this region, when the big cities were, it's quite natural that they can be transported along the river valley to Pompeiopolis. And I will talk later about imports brought by ships from Mediterranean and from other regions. So I think that the main connection line of Pompeiopolis with the world was Amisos. Not, I don't agree with Andrei. Maybe you remember last week he talked about Amastris, which is more or less here. So the distance between Pompeiopolis and Amastris and Amisos is more or less the same. But we made excursion yesterday to Amastris by car, and we can imagine that transporting goods through the really high mountains, it's very difficult, if not possible at all, but connection to the Black Sea from the east is quite convenient along the river valley. And here is generally in the northern Anatolia, the easiest connection between inland and to the coast. So I think Amisos was the main port of delivering, let's say, not only fine pottery, but also amphora. For example, Sinop is cut from Pompeiopolis is cut from Sinop by high mountains, and for example in Pompeiopolis we don't have too many Sinopian amphorae. We have much more so-called South Pontic ones. But again, Andrei is in favor of Amastris production of this amphora. I would rather say that they are from Amisos. But well, the next slide. So the big difference between Mediterranean and the Black Sea is that Black Sea in the second half of the 3rd century, Black Sea was the Roman Empire in the Black Sea region was invaded by Goths, by Gothic tribes, which first conquered Dacia, then attacked Mesia, but made many. They also captured Bosporan Kingdom, which was in alliance with Rome, and had a big fleet, commercial but also military, and so they used the fleet to make raids in the northern Asia Minor. So they plundered coastal cities, especially Trabzon, but made also some inland raids. And it was really destructive for the whole economy. And at that time, production and trade of fine pottery, especially trade, declined completely. So in the late 3rd century, early 4th century, we have nothing. I mean, I studied contexts in the North Black Sea, and there are massive destruction layers, and well. And the next slide. So the let's say economy was rebuilt under Constantine I in the 4th century, and also the production of crafts of various goods was re-established, and especially trade, which was then safe again. And we have now this distribution of production centers of late Roman terra sigillata, or so-called red slip wares in the late antiquity. This is the situation between mid-4th and mid-6th century. So the main production center is North Africa, in today Tunisia. The second important is Foça in Turkey. Let's say they were two, let's say global, or just the main production centers and products of this workshop we can find throughout the empire. Then we have regional workshops like Late Normandy, misleadingly called Cypriot for many years. Then we have our Pontic Red Slip, Egyptian, so the regional distribution. So, for example, Late Normandy is present here in the Eastern Mediterranean, Egyptian in Egypt, and Pontic in northern Anatolia, but also around the Black Sea. The next slide. Yes, here we have the imports of late Roman red slip wares in Pompeiopoulos. 10 years ago, it was more or less 600,000. Now I can imagine it's around 9 or 10,000, but the proportions are more or less the same. So the vast majority is Pontic red slip. Then it's so-called Micaceous red slip. I would need much more time to explain it in detail, so we can abandon for this evening this group. But then we have Mediterranean imports like African and Phocian. And this is also another group which is, let's say, predecessor of the locally made pottery. So it is locally made, but it's not very significant in numbers. Next slide. So, Pontic red slip. I will show you some examples. Here is the distribution of this pottery. My hypothesis also is that the vessels were produced in Western Pontus, but you can see the finds are all around the Black Sea, with concentration in lower Danube limes, and then the southwestern Crimea, Bosporus Chimericos, and also in Kolchis. Then in northern Turkey, we have in any place regularly excavated, like Sinop. Here we have Pompeiopoulos, and some places Comana Pontica, some Tavium. But interestingly, Pompeiopoulos is practically the westernmost site with big presence of this pottery. Last year, a colleague of Mevlut showed me pottery from Prussias at Hypium, which is somewhere here, I think. No, here. This chair, and they have completely other pottery, Bithynian pottery, but among the finds I found also but just one fragment of this Pontic red slip. So the vessels penetrated westwards, but not in big quantities. So it means that these mountains to the west of Pompeiopolis were the natural barrier for the trade. And interestingly, the Pontic red slip pottery is not present in Constantinople so far, and we don't know finds from the Aegean, from Mediterranean. So it's northern Anatolian and Black Sea phenomenon. The next slide. So the finds from Pompeiopolis, 10 years ago it was, as I said, about 4,000. We have the most popular were big dishes, inspired by African prototypes. You can see so form 1A and A/B. The decorated ones were even bigger dishes with so-called comb decoration, form 3, then small bowls, and some jugs. As you can see, here we have diagnostic fragments and, let's say, non-diagnostic or less diagnostic, because we cannot say that they are completely non-diagnostic, because we can say at least that they were dishes. I mean, big vessels and bowls are here, so there is a big difference. Not only because the dishes were bigger, so it could break in more fragments, but generally they were more popular. And unfortunately, we don't have too many jugs. The jugs are very nice. It is also the difference between Mediterranean and the Black Sea that in African red slip, jugs were very limited. I mean, not exported, practically not exported from Tunisia. But in this Pontic red slip, we have very elegant jugs, which were copied from the silver prototypes. Next slide. Here, find from the beginning of the excavations in Pompeiopolis, I think only one almost complete vessel. Next slide. Then African. As you remember from the pie chart before, it's comparing to thousands of fragments of Pontic red slip, then we have a few hundreds. Maybe 10 years ago it was around 200, now maybe 300 or 400. But it's obvious because of the distance. Next slide. So the ships, the vessels were transported by ships, and we, as a, let's say, background of our finds, you can see that they are also present all around the Black Sea region, but in very limited numbers. I have some evidence from the north. They are around 1% of the late Roman materials. Next slide. And in Pompeiopolis, we have mostly imports from the, let's say, late 4th, early 5th century. So the predominant is the big form 67. Then the form 50, you can see that form 50 was the prototype of the or inspiration for the Pontic red slip form 1, a very simple, not decorated dish. And these dishes were stamped. And well, in 3 quarters since the second quarter of the 5th century, Northern Africa was occupied by Vandals, so the trade was limited at that time. And since reconquest of Justinian, the imports in the 6th century also came back to the north, and we have also in Pompeiopolis some fragments of big plates. Like 104, 105 from 6th century, and then a very nice bowl of 99. And the latest vessel, African vessel, well, these are, as you see, the numbers are not very high. Here, 20 fragments 10 years ago, but they are from 6th century, and form 109, it's already 7th century import. It's very important, but I come back to this later on. Next slide. Yes, Mediterranean sigillata, late Roman sigillata, were stamped. The vessels from 4th, 5th century, 4th, early 5th century were stamped with some geometric, very simple motifs, but in the 6th century there are more figural representations which we have here from our Pompeiopolis finds. Next slide. And then this form 109 from the 7th century, which has a burnished pattern. So stamping was abandoned at that time, and the decoration was made by burnished, some just regular, but also some floral patterns. So we have from the Odeon, from the Canadian excavations in Odeon, there were some fragments of this pottery from the 7th century. Next slide. Then I will show you some imports from Phocaea. So closer, but next slide. Also the background, Black Sea, concentration in Lower Limes, Crimea, Bosporus Chimericos, and then also in Pompeiopolis. Next slide. Interestingly, the numbers of fragments of African red slip and Phocæan red slip is the same, despite the difference between the workshops. I mean, Aegean one is much closer than African. And the explanation is that the import began earlier with African red slip, because Phocæan production developed slowly in the course of 5th century, and they used the situation when Africa was occupied by Vandals and developed very much production in the later 5th century and continued especially in 6th century. So we have a very short period of time of importing these vessels, because, as I said, at the edge, I mean at the end, very end of the 5th and beginning of the 6th century, the imports not stopped, but drastically reduced of long distance imports. So it also it was also the case of the late Roman sea pottery. So we have practically half of a century for importing this pottery, comparing to, let's say, 2 centuries of Africa. So the same. That's why the numbers are the same. And well, deep dishes, very standardized selection of forms. This is from the, let's say, late 5th, early 6th century. The latest form which we found in bigger numbers. Next slide. So unfortunately, we have only small fragments, mostly small fragments of this. Only one bigger vessels, I don't have here the photograph, was found in the accumulation of theater of this kind. And the vessels were also stamped, usually with Christian motifs. Next slide. Well, so we go now to the local production. As I said, according to the evidence from various contexts, I think that this change happened at the end of the 5th, early 6th century. Imports were very much limited, and the production of locally made pottery was just exploded. The problem was that the raw material, the clay here in the Pompeiopolis region, is very bad for fine pottery, for pot generally, for pottery, because it contains a lot of mica, which is we have the same situation with Eastern Sigillata B in Meander Valley, but they solved the problem at that time, putting a very thick layer of slip. But here in the late antiquity, they saved material, and well, I mentioned the predecessor of micaceous burnished ware, which was covered by red slip, but it was not very successful. There are no complete profiles. That's why I didn't didn't show you, but they started to produce vessels, burnished vessels, which looked like red slip because they were shining, and the potting, let's say, technique was very good, but because of the bad clay, the vessels were not endurable. The clay flaked off very quickly. That's why it was not a, let's say, big success in long distance trade, but just a local phenomenon. And here you have examples that of inspirations. Here, the African form, not very popular, I must say, but very elegant. And here, in the local production of the early 6th century, almost one-to-one copy. Next slide. But here we have the micaceous. I call this pottery micaceous burnished ware, and they were produced in thousands of vessels. So we have a lot of finds now from the early Byzantine context, from the 6th, 7th century. But you can see some inspiration also from the Pontic red slip, I think, with the rim, and this very popular African 99 form. You can see the equivalent in local vessel. The next slide. Also, decoration techniques were similar. This is the earliest find from the Basilica from this year. I clean, unfortunately, we don't have a complete profile because it was just a base of a plate, but you can see here the late, let's say, from the second half of the 5th century decoration of Pontic red slip dish, and very similar in micaceous burnished ware, made by so-called comb of 4 or sometimes 5 teeth, which with them you can produce just circles, wavy bands, but also some impressions of the teeth, like for example here. So obvious, let's say, inspiration. But the problem is that, as I said, the bad clay didn't allow to. This type of decoration could not resist. As you can see here, it's also in this part already a bit destroyed. So that's why, next slide. Very quickly they replaced the technique of decorating the locally made vessels with painting. So small bowls, but also big plates, and big plates were painted with white and red paint. Next slide. Very simple, just circles, white and red. Next slide. Sometimes wavy bands also. Next slide. Or combined. I mean, white wavy band, red and red white red bands. Next slide. And maybe can you come back to turn back to the previous, if not, if it's possible. If not, we can. So you can see that the burnished surface, it's really, sometimes it's extremely well done. So it looks, when you look at this, it looks like red slip vessel, but but it's due to the technique, not material. Next slide. And we have also some closed vessels, like let's say juglets or mugs, which again, because of bad clay, they were not tight for liquids. So that's why they used the bitumen from the area of Boyabat. There are natural sources of bitumen, and they make, let's say, isolation inside of the of vessels. We found a lot of fragments with this dark layer inside of closed vessels, of jugs. And decoration, again here, white and red motifs, very simple, but interestingly, we have a lot of finds of this Christian, and it's always the same pattern. So when we have a closed vessel, like here, the same, against the handle, in the central part, it's a red cross, and on both sides, there are the red cross in white dotted oval always, and then we have something like 2 dots in white dotted circles on both sides. Next slide. Here the jug. Here is also the red cross. It's poorly visible, unfortunately, but it is like the same with oval. And next slide. And the same motif is present also on the, let's say, common pottery or coarse pottery, or which I call semi-fine, because some part of pottery which was studied by Andrei was also decorated by painting. I call this pottery Microshoes painted ware, and we have the same pattern with red crosses of red dotted ovals. Next slide. So some examples of this pottery, and motifs are very similar to this from the Microshoes burnished ware. So wavy bands, white dots, and red bands. Next slide. So anybody who excavates now Basilica can recognize the finds from these days. Next slide. So also some previous finds. And also from Odeon from last year, there were many fragments of this kind. So they are dated to the 6th, 7th century. Next slide. And well, with the imports, everything was easy to concerning chronology, because we have external evidence from other sites, for Mediterranean imports, of course, the top sites like Athens, Antioch, and so on, Carthage. And for Ponticlet slip, we have very good evidence from all around Black Sea. But for locally made pottery, it was, of course, from the very beginning, the problem to establish chronology of these painted or burnished vessels. At the very beginning, Latife tried to convince me that they must be very early, because they remind some, let's say, styles of Hellenistic painted pottery from Central Anatolia, and so on and so on. But at that time, I noticed that, according to the excavations in Sector C, which is now covered, not visible, that this building was abandoned already in the late 3rd century, and in this context, there were no single find of this painted vessel, so they cannot be early Roman. Next slide. And then we have very good evidence from the theater. So here the picture from Latife excavations. You see the accumulations of the dumps covering the lower rows of seats of the theater. Next slide. And then excavated by Mehmet Ali, you see also the layers of accumulations covered the lower part of the theater. And we have a lot already from Latife excavations. I noticed that in these accumulations there are almost Pontic red slip wares with no painted and Microshoes fragments. So it was also clear evidence that the painted and Microshoes must be earlier than, let's say, 5th century. Next slide. And then last year, the new evidence came from the Odeon, which was already a small fragment of this was excavated something like 10 years ago by Canadian expedition. And I noticed that the materials are very, very late. It was also used as a dump for rubbish, for dumping rubbish. You can see that Odeon was robbed completely from the. There are no single seat preserved, only some parts here in this, let's say, scanner. And it was also filled with rubbish, but completely different than in theater. In theater, we have mostly 4th, 5th century. Here we have 6th, 7th century with a lot of, with almost 100% of the Microshoes burnished ware, with very limited number of imports. Next slide. Here you see the amount, the boxes with the last year finds of fine pottery. So around more than 1,000 big fragments of mica shoes, burnished and painted wares, and almost only around 50 fragments of Pontic red slip, which we can assume as residual material, and but contemporaneous from the same time. I mean, from the 6th, 7th century, we have something like 3 or 4 fragments, imported fragments of African sigillata from 6th century, and also from the 7th century with burnished patterns. And what we have next slide, what is interesting, late Roman ungüentaria. These are the finds from Odeon, and this is the model from I don't remember now, another, maybe from the villa or from another area, so generally, late Roman ungüentaria are very special vessels, very small, around maximum 20 centimeters, to carry some very precious special liquids, maybe perfumes, maybe medicine, maybe olive for church purposes, and some of them were stamped. And they are generally dating in the literature of concerning Mediterranean, because in this part in the Black Sea we have almost nothing. And in Pompeiopolis, in Hadrianopolis, there are some finds, but in Pompeiopolis we have quite a lot. And they are dated to the 6th, 7th century, this general, let's say, frame. And we had from the theater, from the, let's say, 5th century, the layers already, so probably late 5th century already, we have something like 20, 30 fragments of ungüentaria, but no single fragment was stamped. And generally from Pompeiopolis before last year, there were altogether maybe 50 fragments and no one was stamped. And from Odeon we have 2 stamps, 2 first stamps. They are very small, always in the lower part of the vessel here, and some monograms, or just here very simple like X, and here more sophisticated. We can try to understand the name written, and yeah, so it's quite important evidence confirming the dating. And the next slide. And also already, I noticed already during the Canadian excavations that there were very few, 2 or 3 fragments of so-called glazed white ware one from Constantinople, which is not, as you see, not very white, but it's conventional names because it is predecessor of glazed white ware 2, which is really white. I mean, the clay is white, very white, and greenish glaze, and here the vessels are well, pinkish. But this pottery is dated from Constantinople to the 7th, 8th centuries. So it also confirmed the dating of this dump. Next slide. We have the most spectacular find of this pottery from Pompeiopolis was also in another area, but a big plate with such decorated motifs. Next slide. And, well, then every year brings something new to our fine pottery, let's say, research. And this year, when at the very beginning of my stay here, when we studied with Ella all finds from Odeon, I noticed that among the finds of painted pottery, there was no single finds of this kind of decoration, which last year I made a catalog of selected finds of painted micaceous painted ware, and I was never sure of, because this is monochrome, it's only white, not white and red, but only white. Motifs are also very simple, some wavy lines, something like that, but I assumed before that it was the same time as micaceous painted ware, so maybe 6th, 7th century, but maybe a minor group but now I realized that in Odeon we don't have any single find of this kind of pottery, but we have them only from the villa. So this will be our domus, officially. So this will be the domus, let's say, contribution to the understanding of fine pottery, local production of fine pottery from Pompeiopolis, because fabric is very similar. It's also very micaceous, maybe a bit more rough than the classical, the 6th, 7th century, but also carefully made. And this photo I took today, I will start to look closer. With Laura, we checked one context, and this were found with the latest glazed pottery. And last year, you remember, Andrei told about amphore, Ganos amphore from 10th, 11th century, and for fineware we have glazed whiteware two of the same time, 10th, 11th century. So maybe it is the evidence of local production of painted pottery in Pompeiopolis at that time, if not as late, maybe 8th, 9th century, who knows? But we can have we have clear continuation of the production until this medieval phase of life in Pompeiopolis. I don't know, maybe one more, or this is the last one. So.